Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Today I'm going to be sharing my entire sketching process for a set of eyes. I'm going to be taking you through everything, starting with my preliminary freehand outline sketch to how I move on to develop different values, meaning highlights, midtones, and darks, using different drawing pencil grades. Along the way, I'll be sharing tons of tips on how to draw eyes that are aligned and as symmetrical as possible when drawing freehand, which can definitely be a challenge. The important anatomical elements to make sure to add into your eye drawings or sketches whenever you're going for mid to higher levels of realism, as well as important proportions to take into account for these different anatomical elements. I'll be sharing the simple drawing supplies that I always make sure to have on hand for this style of drawing, how I like approaching eyelashes and eyebrows, and much, much more. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so here are the drawing supplies that I'm going to be using for today's eye study. I am going to be working in a spiral sketchbook from Canson. This is a simple, basic drawing sketchbook. The paper in this sketchbook is not very textured at all. It's relatively smooth. I'm going to be using 4 different drawing pencil grades. I'm going to be starting out with my HB, and I'm going to be moving incrementally towards softer pencil grades. So I'm going to be then moving on to a 2B, then to a 4B, and then when I'm developing my darkest values, then I'm going to be using a 6B. I have a regular soft graphite eraser on hand, as well as 2 other types of erasers. I have my Mono Zero eraser, that's that barrel or pen-like looking eraser right there in the middle. The Mono Zero eraser is super helpful to pull out highlights or remove excess graphite from very small, narrow areas. And it's also very helpful when you're drawing hair and things like that because it helps you create textures. I also have a kneaded eraser on hand. That's that chewed up bubblegum looking blue thing that I have right there. That's a kneaded eraser, and I mostly use my kneaded eraser to do tapping over areas where I want to remove excess graphite from, and whenever I need to do a little bit of cleanup here and there. Though there are many artists out there who use kneaded erasers to pick up highlights and remove graphite from very small areas. Honestly, for me, the Mono Zero works best for that, but I still feel that the kneaded eraser can really come in handy to do some cleanup. And aside from that, for this sketch, I also have a ruler on hand, which is going to help me with that initial alignment in my preliminary outline sketch. All right, so let's go ahead and jump straight into this process. So I am going to get started with my outline sketch. I am using my HB pencil to get started, and I like drawing as lightly as possible because these lines and blocky shapes that I'm going to be laying down right now, I don't really want them to be visible at the end, and I also want to be able to erase my mistakes and refine my drawing as I go. The very first thing that I did was I used my ruler to draw a straight horizontal line across my paper. With that horizontal line in place, what I am doing right now is I am actually measuring out 3 equal spaces. With the size of the sketchbook that I'm personally working with, I decided to go with 1.5 inches for this width that I am creating for these 3 equal spaces. So as you can see, I use my ruler and I just simply created little teeny tiny vertical tick marks along that horizontal line as I measured out these 1.5 inch spaces. And the reason why it's so important to actually measure these spaces out and make sure that you have 3 equal spaces is because when it comes to facial proportions, the width of one eye has to fit in between your 2 eyes. If you don't pay attention and make sure that that width, that space in between your 2 eyes is equal to the width of one eye, it's highly likely that your eyes are gonna then end up being way too close or way too far apart. And yes, of course, there are people who have close set eyes and wide set eyes, people who have eyes that are slightly larger and people who have eyes that are slightly smaller. And absolutely, when you get to a point at which you're trying to draw someone specifically, like to their full likeness, then totally you have to make sure to slightly modify these proportions that I'm going to be sharing with you today so that you can actually make your drawing look like the person. But it's hugely important that as a beginner, you stem from understanding basic facial proportions, average, so to speak, facial proportions, and then understand that really when it comes to developing a likeness to a specific person, the modification, the refinement that happens when it comes to making certain features a bit larger, a bit smaller, a bit farther apart, a bit closer together, whatever the case may be, honestly, it's very, very minimal. You make those teeny tiny refinements in all of the different facial features, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the forehead, etc., and so forth. And all together in combination, those teeny tiny changes that you make your face look like the person's face. So stem from average proportions, from understanding this. All right, so once I had my horizontal line to help me with the alignment of my eyes and also my tick marks separating out 3 equal widths or spaces, then I started drawing in what I like to refer to as envelopes. And if you've seen past sketching or drawing tutorials from me before, then you've probably already heard me talk about envelopes. These are just general blocky shapes that I add in, that I create with a group of straight lines. I'm not really worrying about curves or anything like that because I'm focusing primarily on laying down a shape that is going to tell me the size, the location, and the general angles created by the shape that I would be then refining these envelopes into. These shapes that I am creating are basically going to contain the eyeballs, tear ducts, and tear lines. Everything else is going to be outside of these shapes. Just a moment ago, you also saw me add in 2 extra horizontal lines along the top and the bottom edges of these eyes. And this is so that I can ensure that the eyes are relatively symmetrical in terms of how tall they are and also in terms of the little angled lines that I am creating. There are different types of eye shapes. Some people have more kind of cat eyes in which the outer corner of the eye is higher up than the inner corner of the eye or where the tear duct is. Other people have the 2 corners, the inner corner where the tear duct is and the outer corner of the eye more or less aligned like an almond shape. And other people have a little bit of like a downward thing going on with the outer corner of the eye. Whatever the case may be, choose an eye shape and maybe even look for reference photos and notice these things in actual real life people. Make a choice for that shape of your eye and then do your best to create a flipped version or mirrored version of your shape. And by all means, help yourself with straight vertical lines, straight horizontal lines, little tick marks, anything that is going to help you create that symmetrical look for your eye shapes. Just make sure to keep drawing lightly so that you can erase those extra guide marks and lines for yourself once they've served their purpose. So what I tried to do in this eye shape was I tried to make the outer corner of these eyes slightly higher up, slightly above that initial horizontal line. And the tear duct, the bottom edge of that tear duct or the inner corner of the eye is actually touching that horizontal line. All right, so once I was happy with those initial general envelope shapes and I made sure to take time to check on that symmetry, it was time to start adding in these different anatomical elements that I have to make sure that I add into these eyes for a believable look. So number 1, I added in the tear duct in the inner corners of these eyes. The second thing that I added in were the crease lines along the top of these eyes. The crease lines are basically where our top eyelids kind of fold over themselves. When we have our eyes closed, we don't see this line because our top eyelid is stretched over our eye. But when we open our eyes and our top eyelids fold over themselves, we see this crease line that is created where our eyelids fold. Depending on the person's eye shape, you may see just a section of this crease. That does happen, but almost always you're going to be able to see at least some amount of this crease along the top of the eyes. The third thing that I'm adding in are the bottom tear lines along the bottom of these eyes. When I started incorporating either the top or the bottom tear line into my eye drawing, it made a huge difference in terms of that level of realism. Depending on where we're seeing the person from, whether they are shorter than us and we're looking down at them, or they are taller than us and we're looking up at them, or we're looking straight forward at an eye level, and whether the person is looking upwards or downwards, we're able to see a bit of their bottom or upper tear line. Tear lines are very important because they give an illusion of thickness to that skin in the upper and lower eyelids. After adding in the lower tear line, I started adding in the largest circle inside of the eyeball, which is the iris. The iris is the section of the eyeball which has color to it. Some of us have brown eyes, some of us have blue eyes, some of us have green eyes. The iris is the section that has that color to it. When I add in the iris and the pupil, which is coming up next, I always make sure that I'm not only placing them in alignment, that both irises are looking either straight forward or off to the side, that they look like they are both looking towards the same direction, and that they are fitting almost exactly in the same spot within that eyeball, but also that their size is believable. The iris is also always partially covered by either the top or the bottom eyelids. If we make the iris entirely visible within that eyeball, our eyes are going to look like they are super surprised or something like that and not relaxed. Something I see a lot of beginners struggling with is that their irises and their pupils are not aligned, or they're making them way too large or way too small. And I have to say, I think a lot of the times this is due to the fact that they're not looking for references, or at least quality references. If you're not aware of what the sizes of these different eye parts are, I would highly, highly recommend taking time to look for reference photos, taking notes, even making time to observe what things look like in real life, because if you don't, you're probably going to end up drawing something the way you think it looks like and not what it actually looks like. Once you have enough practice drawing eyes using references, you're able to draw eyes from imagination that look believable. So what I am taking note of here is how much negative space in terms of that sclera, or the white of the eye, is left around the iris and the pupil, and trying to replicate that on the opposite eye. You can see how inside of the iris, I added in the smaller circle, which is the pupil. The pupil is basically that black looking circle, the smaller circle inside of our eyeball. And this is actually a hole in our eyeball that opens and closes to let in more or less light depending on the light situation in the environment around us. Of course, we have corneas, which are a transparent layer that goes over the iris and the pupil, and it protects them. Okay, so I already talked about the sclera. So the sclera is what we refer to as the whites in our eyes, which, as I'm going to mention later, scleras are not really white, and it's a huge problem that I see a lot of beginners struggle with as well. They leave the sclera completely white, and then their drawing ends up looking a bit too cartoony, and this is because the sclera always has different colors and values throughout them because of the veins inside of the sclera, and also because of the shadow created by the eyelids, and also because of the spherical structure or nature of our eyeballs and how they are sitting very deep within our eye sockets in our skulls. Okay, so the final thing that I added in there very lightly are a few highlights inside of both eyeballs. Having bright highlights inside of both eyeballs is incredibly important to actually make these eyes come to life and create a 3D look to them, and also make them look a little bit moist because our eyeballs are always moist. Our tear ducts are constantly creating tears to keep our eyeballs clean. And so if we fail to add in highlights into our eyes, it's highly likely that they're not going to look very realistic. So what I like doing is I map out some little shapes very lightly. Most of the time I add them in on the upper right section of the iris. Sometimes it goes a little bit past and out the iris, and maybe a smaller one opposite to that on the lower left corner, or vice versa. Whatever highlights you add into one eyeball, make sure that you add them into the other eyeball approximately in the same place and approximately in the same size. Highlights don't have to be mirrored or flipped, because highlights usually go hand in hand with the location of the light source. Wherever the light source is located in relation to the subject, that is basically going to have an impact on the highlights that you're able to see in those eyeballs. Once I was done with sketching in all of these different anatomical elements that I had to make sure to add in inside of the eyeball and around the eyeball, it was time to start adding in the eyebrows. Now, this is just my outline sketch, so I'm not going to be shading anything in or adding too much detail if I don't absolutely need it. So I'm just going to be creating the basic eyebrow shape, focusing on location, focusing on proportion, focusing on angles, and all that. So to make sure that my eyebrows look right, first I draw in 2 vertical lines running straight up. So where those tear ducts are in the inner corners of the eyes, you want to draw 2 vertical lines going up. Try to make them as straight as possible. You can always support yourself with your ruler if you need to. But these vertical lines are going to tell you where the inner corners of those eyebrows are going to be, where you should be starting that shape. Make sure that you don't draw your eyebrow shape way too low, too close to the eye, or way too high up. Once again, support yourself with references if you need to, but this is also something that I often see beginners do. They place their eyebrows way too close to their eyes or way too high up. Just like with eye shapes, there are many different eyebrow shapes, but almost always there's going to be some sort of arch somewhere in the outer, maybe 3/4 of the way through, in the outer portion of that eyebrow. If you don't know where to end that outer tail of your eyebrows, something that helps me is to visualize a near 45-degree angle line from that initial horizontal line that you created. Or draw a near 45-degree angle line going upwards from the outer ends of your eye. And that is going to tell you where the outer tip of that tail end of your eyebrow should be. Remember that that outer tail of the eyebrows are kind of curved and wrapping around our skulls. If you make that tail go out super long past the outer edges of those eyes, that is going to create a flat look to those eyes. So once I was happy with the shape of those eyebrows, and by the way, you can definitely see imperfection here and there. Things are not completely perfectly symmetrical, but this is good enough for me because a lot of like minor refinements can be developed through the shading that I'm going to be doing next. So I'm not too worried about the minor imperfections that I see here and there. But once I was happy with how everything looked, I usually like adding in some sort of indication or structure for the nose right in between the 2 eyes. Because our noses are protruding facial features that have a lot of volume to them, and they create shadows on the sections around the eyes and whatnot. And for me, having that nose there facilitates the process of developing different values, darks, midtones, and lights in the sections around the eyes so that I can actually make this set of eyes look a little bit more believable. So that's why I just very quickly added in a very simple structure for that nose to help me visualize things a little bit more. And after I placed in a very general kind of nose structure for myself there, I mapped out with a couple of lines 2 dark sections that we usually see right underneath the bottom eyelids in eyeballs. They're spherical forms that protrude out at least a tiny bit from our skulls, right? And these spheres push out our eyelids, and most of us have at least a little bit of a shadow section or dark under eye section created by these spheres that are pushing out and creating a volume that is impeding the light from hitting that little section of very thin skin under our eyes. So that's what I mapped out there with a couple of very light lines. All right, so with my outline sketch already prepared, already checked, and ready to go, it is time to start shading things in. And before moving forward, I want to really take a moment and recommend you spend all the time you need to spend on that preliminary outline sketch, because that is the base and the foundation for everything that is coming up next. Especially if you're going for higher levels of realism, you want this to look semi-believable. Those proportions, those locations, those shapes, they have to be great in order to move forward to the next thing. If they're not, no amount of shading, no amount of detail or texture is going to fix your eyes. Throughout the entire preliminary outline sketching process, I was using my HB pencil. It was now time to move on to the next pencil grade, which is my 2B. I'm going to be going incrementally softer and softer with my graphite as I go. You can see how I'm using my pencil in an almost horizontal position, very near to parallel to that surface of the paper. And the reason this is because I want the entire side of the tip of the pencil to come into contact with the paper as opposed to just the tip, so that I can cover up a larger space of that paper quicker with my graphite. I am not pressing down hard at all as I am doing this, and I am focusing on the darkest areas that I'm going to be developing in my drawing. So I got started with the pupil because that is a near black shape that I'm going to be developing. And in the pupil, because it's black, I actually allowed myself to press down a tiny bit harder and make sure that I wasn't leaving sections of paper uncovered with that graphite, so that I can make those very dark since the very beginning. And everything else, I'm going in with a very small amount of pressure and just starting to deposit and lay down a layer of graphite in those sections where I would be developing darker values in. I am using a reference photo to notice areas of highlights, midtones, and darkest darks. And I would highly recommend you do the same for your own eye drawings, especially in the beginning and especially when you're going for mid to higher levels of realism. I am not trying to make these eyes look like the eyes of the person in the photo, but having a reference photo that you can continue observing and coming back to throughout your drawing process so that you can notice areas of lightest lights, areas of midtones, and areas of darkest darks. It's super, super helpful as you're doing your shading. So I noticed where those darkest areas are in those eyes in the reference photo, and that's where I started by laying down my graphite. In these initial layers of graphite, I am trying to get some amount of graphite that I can work with on my paper. I laid it down very, very lightly, and once I had a good amount of graphite on my paper, I took my blending stump, and what I am doing right here is I am starting to blur that graphite and really smooth it out onto that paper. I am not pressing down hard with my blending stump at all, because that again can create marks and can damage and scratch your paper if you're not careful. So I'm continuing to be very gentle with my drawing tools. All I am doing is I'm smoothing out that graphite that I've just placed on my paper. It's important that you have a good amount of graphite on your paper before bringing out your blending stump, because otherwise there's not really going to be much to smooth out and move around and create gradients with. You can see how that graphite is becoming blurrier. I am softening out all of those edges that I created with my graphite shapes. And I am doing gentle pulling of that graphite that I have deposited on my paper upwards, outwards, creating those soft gradients into areas of lighter values. It can be tricky if you've never used a blending stump before. It certainly requires some practice. A couple of things that are helpful to know about is that graphite starts collecting on the tip of your blending stump. And if you're not careful along the way and kind of continue acknowledging the amount of graphite that has collected in the tip, you can start really muddying and dirtying up your entire drawing. A ton of graphite starts getting collected in there to the point that you can literally draw something with your blending stump because of all of that graphite that is on the tip. So be careful. And if you need to clean that blending stump, you can either file it down, you can use a X-Acto knife or a crafting knife to remove some slivers of that dirty paper and reveal the paper underneath, because really all blending stumps are is just a roll of paper that is very tightly rolled up. Another thing that you can accidentally start doing with your blending stump if you're not careful is you can start creating stop and start marks. The way that I avoid this is I am not pressing down with my blending stump hard at all. I'm just very gently running that side of my blending stump over my graphite and kind of sliding it on that graphite. And also, again, keeping track of how much graphite has collected on the tip really helps. All right, so after having smoothed out and blurred out those initial graphite shapes that I had laid down, I used my Mono Zero eraser to pick up that graphite that had collected in my highlights. And then it was time to switch on over to my next pencil grade. So I'm now using my 4B pencil, getting softer and softer, you guys. With my 4B pencil on hand, what I am focusing on right now, and I am still trying to use the side of the tip of my pencil, I am focusing on darkest dark areas once again, pushing those darkest dark areas. So I started with the pupil, which I know I want to make look like one of the darkest areas in these eyes at the end. And then I am focusing on carving out those darkest abstract shadow shapes that I'm able to see in that reference photo. I'm focusing on darkest dark areas where I want to push shadows and dark values a little bit more. Usually these are smaller shapes within the larger previous lighter value shape you've already developed. And once I feel I've layered enough graphite, I'm gonna go back to my blending stump and smooth things out once again. And it's really a back and forth method or situation here. I layer a bit of graphite. When I feel I have enough graphite on my paper, I go ahead and switch on over to my blending stump and do some smoothing out. Then if I feel I need to darken areas a little bit more, I once again add a little bit more graphite, and I smooth it out again. And I even pull out my Mono Zero in between if I feel I've muddied up or have darkened my lightest light highlights. I go ahead and clean those up here and there throughout the process as well. I stay patient and take it incrementally, a step at a time, towards darker values. It is very important to continue looking at that reference photo and noticing different value areas, noticing what areas are super light, what areas are lighter midtones, what areas are darker midtones, what areas are darkest darks, because you definitely don't want to mindlessly start placing layers of graphite in very light areas, because then you're gonna have to go in and erase all of that graphite back up and you're gonna muddy up your drawing. So continue looking at that reference photo throughout your entire drawing process. Make sure that you're continuing to see, acknowledge different value shapes, and know what it is that you're going in to do. Are you going in to push a darker value? Are you going in to work on a transition? What is it that you're trying to do? And stay focused on that, because when you stop looking at your reference photo and you start mindlessly just placing graphite on your drawing, that's when things start becoming very messy and you start making mistakes that are very difficult to fix. I wouldn't recommend switching to your softest pencil grades until the majority of your value work with your lightest lights and your midtones has already been developed, because softer pencil grades such as the 6B, the 8B, the 9B, etc., they're very, very soft and very smudgy. The softer the graphite, the darker and the smudgier it is, and the easier it's gonna be to create a mess. Also, there is no need to start pressing down too hard on your paper with your pencils. If you do that, you're gonna start scratching your paper and creating lines and marks that you can't really erase back up. One of the beauties of working with a variety of different pencil grades, harder pencil grades and softer pencil grades, is that you can very easily develop dark areas with soft pencil grades without having to press down very hard at all. And if you do decide to go in with just the tip of your pencil and start pressing down a little bit harder, make sure that you're leaving that until the very end. And this is because once you start scratching or burnishing your paper, that tooth of your paper will be affected and you won't be able to lay down or apply that graphite like you would be able to when that tooth was intact. In just a bit, I'm going to go back in with my 4B pencil to push darker value areas a little bit more after having done a little bit of smoothing out with my blending stump. It's really worth thinking of whether you want to push darker value areas a little bit more, continue developing those values with that same pencil grade that you were using before switching to the next softer pencil grade. I don't know if you can tell, but there are two almost horizontal lines going across my two eyes over the bridge of the nose there. You can see them in the inner corners of the eyes, right on either side of the upper section of the bridge of the nose. It was probably due to the fact that I had some paper or material pressed inside of this sketchbook at some point, and that left a mark on the page. But I just did a little bit of cleanup with my kneaded eraser, picked up some of that graphite a little bit so that it wasn't as visible, and I'm pretty sure that as I continue developing darkest dark shapes in these areas, those lines will become less and less visible. However, I did make a mental note to stop using my sketchbooks as folders to randomly place loose sheets of paper in. Okay, so this is me going back in with my 4B pencil after having done some smoothing and blurring out with my blending stump. I'm going to be working on pushing darker value areas and little shapes a little bit more. There is almost always going to be a darker ring around the iris. So that is something that I go in to darken, but hopefully you can see how I darkened only sections of it and I didn't go in and create an outline around the iris or anything like that. And I also started darkening some sections in the sclera or the whites of the eyes, especially right under the top eyelid and also in the inner and outer edges to create a little bit more of that spherical look to the eyeballs. And I even started developing a variety of values inside of the eyebrow shapes already without even getting started with the hair texture. I noticed that the outer edges of my eyes were a little bit asymmetrical. The shape was a little bit different. And what I did was I just worked on that shading a little bit. I darkened certain sections or lightened certain sections that would make sense so that I could fix that asymmetry. And that fixed the problem. Acknowledging the different value areas, the lightest lights, the midtones, the darkest darks, as abstract, irregular shapes is hugely important. I am doing my best to stay away from the look of harsh lines, harsh marks, outlines, anything like that, because that is going to be super distracting. And in realism, there are no outlines. So by acknowledging the darkest dark shapes, the midtone shapes, and the lightest shapes as abstract, irregular shapes, that is going to help you stay away from any sort of outline. In realism, it's all about developing edges and not outlines. You can see outlines happening in coloring book pages and cartoons. Everything has a thick black outline around it. But in real life, that doesn't happen. We have edges in real life, edges in which different values meet. There is a darker value shape next to a lighter value shape. And sometimes those edges get lost, and other times those edges are sharper and defined. In realism, whether you're drawing or painting, there is almost always going to be a combination of sharp defined edges with soft gradual transitions between your different values. It really takes learning to observe what things look like in real life, which we can really only do via reference photos, via seeing things in real life, and really breaking away from that conditioning that so many of us have. A lot of us were taught and trained to color inside the lines. And our brains are comfortable with creating outlines around things and creating very defined looking edges and things like that. And when you're trying to develop your skills with higher levels of realism when it comes to drawing and or painting, you really have to learn to see things in a different way. For a lot of us, our brains are going to tell us that we have to go in and create an obvious line around all of these different sections or elements of our drawing, and we really don't. In realism, changes between different values, they're subtle many times, and other times they're sharper. But there is never going to be an obvious outline around these different areas. And it is really a matter of training yourself to observe different value areas in a reference photo or things that you have in front of you in real life. Comparing areas, whether one area is darker or lighter than the other area, and doing your best to make those values happen in your drawing. All right, so I was pretty happy with my development of different values, my lightest lights and my midtones. And it was time to get started with adding in the hair texture in the eyebrows. For this, I'm going to continue using my 4B pencil. I just made sure that it was nice and sharp before getting started with drawing in the eyebrow hairs. It's very important that it is very, very sharp. This said, I am still not pressing down very hard. When it comes to drawing the eyebrow hairs, it's really a matter of noticing the length of the hair and also the direction of the hair growth. This is another case in which I would highly recommend looking at a reference photo. If you just start drawing lines in any direction, most likely than not, your eyebrows are not going to look very realistic. So notice that length of those hairs and the direction of the hair growth, and that length and that direction is most likely going to change throughout the eyebrow. What I am doing here is I am using flicking motions, laying down hair by hair using those flicking motions. Those flicking motions are going to help those little lines that I create for those eyebrow hairs look tapered, look like the root of that eyebrow hair or that place where that line starts, a little bit darker and thicker than the end of it. Make sure that your tapered lines are at least slightly curved, because if you make them perfectly straight, they're also not going to look very natural. And I also like adding in a little bit of irregularity throughout the outer edges of the eyebrows. Just like little flyaway hairs, having a few eyebrow hairs sticking out in different ways, just a few here and there, adds to that natural look. After having added in these eyebrow hairs, I go in with my blending stump. I gently run that tip of that blending stump over the hairs that I just laid down, softening them a bit. And I'm going in now with my Mono Zero eraser, especially right along the bottom edge of that eyebrow, and using upwards curved flicking motions in the same way, using the same kind of stroke that I was using with my pencil before. And this also helps create a little bit of irregularity in that underneath section of the eyebrow, making things look a little bit more natural. If you pick up some of that graphite and that white shape created by the eraser looks a little bit too stark, you can go in with your blending stump and make it look softer by just running that tip of that blending stump over that white shape. Throughout the next couple of minutes, I'm going to continue doing a little bit more of this, some cleanup throughout these eyes, and just a few little refinements here and there before switching on to my softest pencil grade that I've selected for this process, which is going to be the 6B. And just in case you haven't noticed, I am really holding myself back from getting started with the eyelashes, because the eyelashes are something that I always make sure to add until the very end after I developed all of my different values throughout my eyes and around my eyes. Because after the eyelashes have been added in, it's very difficult to do work around them. So any softening that you need to do, any work on transitions, any darkening of values, or picking up of graphite in highlight areas, I would highly recommend doing all of that before adding in your eyelashes. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking. It was finally time to do my work with my softest pencil grade, which I chose for this study, which is the 6B. So with the 6B, I'm going to be focusing in very darkest dark areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo. So once again, I'm getting started with the same things. The the pupil, the shadows inside of the sclera created by the eyelids and the spherical kind of nature or structure of that eyeball, and the darkest shadows around the eyes, along the creases, under the eyebrows, and I'm even going to be creating a few extra eyebrow hairs with the softest pencil grade. I like making sure that even throughout my eyebrows, there is a variety of values throughout those hairs. By making some of those eyebrow hairs look softer and others more defined, I'm also able to create a more natural look. I switch between my 6B pencil and my blending stump a few times until I arrive at a look that I like, and I continue making sure that I only place the graphite where I really need to darken and just a bit at a time, especially because this graphite is very smudgy and I don't want to get it into lighter value areas. Okay, so we're about ready to finally start adding in the eyelashes. I'm going to switch on back to my 2B pencil. I'm going to make sure it is well sharpened, and I'm going to go ahead and quickly explain a few key things for drawing eyelashes while I do a little bit of practice work on an extra sheet of drawing paper before adding them into my drawing, which I would highly recommend you do the same if you have little to no practice drawing eyelashes, because they can certainly be tricky. All right, so the very first thing is that it's important to know that the eyelashes located right above the tear duct or in the inner corner of the eye, they are going to be shorter and they get longer as you move towards the outer corner of the eye. The second thing is that they curve slightly in opposite directions as you move from the inner corner of the eye towards the outer corner of the eye. The same thing goes for the eyelashes along the lower eyelid. It's just that with the eyelashes along the lower eyelid, those are usually a lot shorter than the upper eyelashes and also somewhat sparser than the upper eyelashes. You also want to use flicking motions so that the root of that eyelash looks slightly thicker and darker than the outer end or outer tip of that eyelash. And one more thing is that there has to be plenty of irregularity among them and even imperfection among them so that they look believable. Otherwise, your eyes may end up looking like the eyes of a doll or something like that. For eyelashes to look believable and realistic, they should be clustering together in different ways. Some of your eyelashes should be overlapping in different ways. Some areas are going to be more sparse than others. And make sure not to go overboard with the amount of eyelashes, or they can also look like fake eyelashes. And finally, also make sure that you're starting those slightly curved tapered lines where the eyelashes actually grow out of. I would recommend observing your own eyes in a mirror and noticing where your eyelashes start or where the root of your eyelashes is right along your tear lines. Okay, so I'm all done with my eyelashes, and right here I am just doing some very final refinements in my eyes, doing some final softening out, some final darkening of darkest darks, and I'm gonna call this eye study done. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply list, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.